The internet is and has always been a place that allows you to make up your own identity. For example, you get to pick your name and branding. Some people online call me Chris, some call me Campster, and some even call me the name of this show, but all of them are names I chose to associate myself with. We choose the context in which we engage and how that context frames us. On this channel, I'm a super dry, monotone games critic who is probably too serious most of the time, but that's how I choose to present myself. On the Spoiler Warning channel, I'm the pedantic smartass who has a reputation for saying a catchphrase I don't actually say. On Facebook, I'm the guy who occasionally sends his wife links to comic book merch, and on Twitter, I'm the cantankerous cynic who flops back and forth between politics and video games. The point is, I get to shape who I am on these platforms, and each of them reflects a different self-selected slice of my identity. As long as there has been a consumer-facing internet, there has been a place to experiment with and even find one's identity, from IRC to instant message chats to web forums to modern social media. And today's game, Secret Little Haven, is largely about that, how technology gives us the ability to define and experiment with identity, and more than that, what that power can mean to a young person on the cusp of adulthood. So just to lay it all out there, Secret Little Haven is a game about a teenage high school student, Alex, slowly asking questions about who she is and realizing that she's trans. And, well, I'm a straight cis dude, so my ability to meaningfully comment on the emotional truths this game is going for is a little bit iffy. But I still want to share the game, in part because I really enjoyed it, but also because, while I didn't go through the exact troubles Alex does in this game, I was almost exactly the same age in the same time period and used almost exactly the same communications method to build a network of friends and a sense of self online. I found myself online as Alex does, and while the game is undeniably a game about a young trans woman discovering who she really is first and foremost, and that's an experience I can't really comment on directly, the way Secret Little Haven chooses to tell its story was deeply nostalgic for me. Alex's technologies and platforms were largely my technologies and platforms. These awkward ways of discovering herself were also the ways I grew into the person I am today. So while our journeys took us on very different paths, I feel like a lot of Alex's story is resonant. Secret Little Haven is set in 1999 and focuses on Alex, a 17-year-old fan of a magical schoolgirl anime named Pretty Guardian's Love Force. Basically a Sailor Moon-style shoujo anime where a team of teenage girls transforms into the Pretty Guardians to fight demons every week. As far as magical girl anime goes, it's implied to be pretty standard fare. But Alex is hardcore into the fandom, so she's always hanging out at her favorite Pretty Guardians forum and chatting about the show on an instant messaging client with all of her friends online. And really, that's kind of the whole game, screwing around on the internet the way teenagers did in 1999. It's very online young person, turn of the century edition. But what this game gets is that for teenagers, and especially socially awkward teenagers, and double especially for queer teenagers, it wasn't just screwing around with some internet randos instead of doing your homework. It's formulating an identity and a sense of self. It's how you built your community of like-minded peers. It's how you found a place where you had a voice in a world where you may often feel voiceless. It was a place where you could dabble in identities that felt new, untested, maybe even dangerous. This little box gave unfettered access to illicit knowledge and the secrets of the world, as well as the company of those who would explore those mysteries with you, to kids who had barely spent a night away from home. It was an era of teenagers basking in the dim glow of a CRT monitor at 2 a.m. to scry a glimpse of a world beyond their borders. Lee Alexander wrote a bit about this in her ebook, Breathing Machines, and while her later writings describe something of a falling out with the romantic idea of the internet, I think this excerpt captures a lot of what Secret Little Haven is going for. Quote, "The first time I was allowed to use internet news groups, it was like suddenly noticing it was dark enough to see stars. All at once, a startling array of possibilities seemed to erupt in front of me. I could browse an impossible library of public bulletin boards, on everything from music to poetry to alien hunting to nihilism to Sailor Moon. Oh, Sailor Moon. It was this anime television series that's now old enough to be having a comeback among young 20-somethings, old enough to be reevaluated as a queer hero story, a subversion of gays for all of us kids growing up in small Luddite towns with oppressive norms. Where I was from, no one went online, they went to field hockey practice and church. At the crux of my adolescence, I was Delilah at alexander.terranet.com. I could never ever forget it, the secret name that let me interlope among Usenet boards like rec.arts.poetry, alt.music.nirvana, and rec.arts.sailormoon. There was life after the preachers, life after school, life after the whirling binary black and white, and here I came squalling and read into all of it, from the dark corners of my father's office where I prayed the real me would never be found. I love how that captures the trepidation and power of going online as a young child before the internet was boring and ubiquitous, if still not what one would call safe. Going online via the computer is for Alex, as the title suggests, her secret little haven. This is emphasized by the fact that the only characters she knows in real life, her father John and her childhood friend Andy, both fail to understand her and try to get her to behave in ways they want rather than in ways she wants. In reality, in MeetSpace, she is given an identity from others, either by parental expectations or by the gendered expectations of an old friend. But online, Alex is accepted wholeheartedly by the Pretty Guardians forum members, with whom she has shared interests and receives no personal judgment for being who she is and liking what she likes. She can be who she sees herself as around them, and in ways I'm not sure even really exist on the internet anymore. If there's one thing that Secret Little Haven absolutely nails, it's the sense of being online as a teenager in 1999, despite it being released in 2018. You wouldn't think the internet has changed all that much in the intervening 2 decades or so, but it absolutely has. First of all, it's now easier to picture a world that's always connected than a world that isn't. We live in a time where Wi-Fi flows through every room in your house, and failing that, there's always using the cellular network on your phone as a fallback. You can connect to the internet through smart TVs and phones and tablets and computers and game consoles. We are drowning in connected devices and 24/7 broadband access. But this was not always the case. Time was, the only way you got online was through a desktop computer. If you were lucky and affluent enough, you may have had your own as a teenager, but most people just had the family computer. This centralized all online activities to a comparatively public room and one that parents could set operating rules for. And if you weren't lucky enough to have broadband internet, it wasn't even online all the time. You had to call into your local dial-up ISP for that. Taking up a phone line and putting pressure on you to get on, do your business, and log off, lest you block important incoming calls. All of this meant that internet time was precious, and the more time you spent staring at a glowing box talking to strangers, the more concerned your parents were likely to get. This drives the core conflict of the narrative. As you can probably guess, Alex and her father John don't really see eye to eye about her time spent online. Alex has been struggling in her studies, having been kicked out of a boarding school, and John blames her struggles on the fact that she's always online talking to people he doesn't know and picking up strange ideas, all of which he thinks distract Alex from living up to her potential, or what he sees as her potential. The more he sees that she's been online instead of studying, the more he attempts to lock her account down and forbid her from accessing the one place she feels comfortable. It's a feeling I'm not sure kids today can really experience. I'm sure they get grounded from screen time, but there was a palpable sense in 1999 that your entire connection to those online communities were hanging by a thread. All it took was for someone to pick up the phone to make a call. Landlines and 56K internet were still a thing in 1999, and your connection was dropped for at least a few minutes until you reconnected. Computers were still expensive, and if it broke, you could be offline for days or weeks until you got a replacement. And if you got grounded from the computer, well, that was it until your parents relented. As a teenager discovering themselves on the internet at the turn of the century, one's opportunities to define themselves were far more open than ever, but also far more precarious. Alex's dad's threats to lock her out of her communities have menace, specifically because of how hard it is to spend time with them in that era of technology. The fragility of those connections give John all of the power. But it's not just the ubiquity and ease of access that's changed in the last 20 years, so too have the platforms we use to communicate. We're used to social media sites that live in the cloud, centralized services that aggregate millions upon millions of users, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. They all house different types of content and focus on different communities, but they all function as platforms in a way that we really didn't have in 1999. The internet of 2018 is largely asynchronous but content-rich. All of that broadband piping videos and pictures and games and text. The internet of yore was less media-rich and less centralized. It focused on synchronous instant messaging set against a vast collection of micro-communities centered around websites that had their own forums. You didn't have Reddit aggregating all of your interests and Facebook aggregating all of your family. You had your game news site and your Cowboy Bebop fan website and your favorite webcomic site and your movie news site, and each typically with its own community with a social in-group and its own way of doing things. This was the social order of the internet in 1999. Archipelagos of communities for websites that were themselves often expressions of fandom. And commonly enough, these websites, and by extension their communities, might be one of several for the same fandom, a point the game lovingly references by including talk of the other Pretty Guardians Love Force forum that's dismissed as having more lax copyright rules and a less discerning crowd. But that micro-sized, hyper-focused community is part of what let you find your own identity on the internet back then. You didn't have a centralized profile that needed to please your close family members and your extended family members and your teachers and your friends. You had a specific context that bound these communities together, and in that context you could seek to fit in. It allowed for the exploration of self far more effectively than the monolithic social media companies of today that swallow all communities as their own and spit them back to you as a tab or a timeline nestled next to your other selves. Finally, there's the heart of the game's play, the instant messaging. There's a lot that sells this. First, there's the writing. Each character has their own voice and style of chatting, and that itself comes to define Alex's relationships with them. Whether it's Samuel and Alex sharing quips and excitedly geeking out about the latest Pretty Guardians news, or Purple Squirrel going from a saccharine, cutesy online presence full of hugs and emoticons and cutesy winks to a self-serious role-playing voice, the writing manages to wring characters and relationships out of a comparatively constrained gimmick. But more than that, the instant messaging captures this specific sense of teenage awkwardness and angst. Like, Jenny is the webmaster for the Pretty Guardians forums that Alex frequents, and when Alex finally meets her, she freaks out a little bit. As an adult, it's sort of funny, freaking out about meeting some college kid running a website, but I remember visiting sites where the webmaster or forum moderator was a local micro-celebrity, where getting noticed by a college-age webmaster when you were barely in high school is like being noticed by a movie star. There's something fundamentally teenagery about looking at people a few years older than you and believing that they have it all figured out. Alex's excitement about meeting Jenny reinforces the idea that these forums have their own communities with their own sense of social status, and it also reminds us how young and unsure Alex is of her own place in the universe. And then there's the fact that Secret Little Haven kicks off multiple conversations at once. This is one of my favorite things the game does, and it helps a lot. First, it opens up the narrative. Because the other users wait for your responses, you're free to chase down whatever threads interest you first before moving on to the other conversations later. But it also means that you're juggling multiple conversations at once, keeping track of all that context in your head, and often also while browsing a web forum or checking your email. It's a simulation of a sort of social hangout interaction we don't really see these days, at least not that I'm aware of. Most instant messaging is done either in Slack or Discord in big groups, or in very short instant messages to send critical information to a specific person one-on-one. But in an era before cell phones were common, ICQ and AOL Instant Messenger and MSN ruled the day for how kids talk to each other after school. In 2018, though, you don't often find yourself with 7 different simultaneous one-on-one conversations going. It's a form of social multitasking that was surprisingly short-lived. And all that shuffling means often enough you miss context. Someone will be going on a rant that takes multiple posts to convey their point, and instead of reading them all one at a time as they come in, you decide to step away and let them finish whatever it is they're saying. And then you come back way later to find they've dropped an emotional truth bomb that you've ignored, and now suddenly you feel really bad and awkward. You were checking the forums while this person was pouring their heart out, and you didn't notice for 10 minutes. Which is another thing. Timing is used really well here to sell this idea. The game doesn't immediately spit back responses to you as soon as you provide input, but instead implements varied delays that mimic the idea that they're thinking about their responses, or ignoring you, or doing something else, or going to the bathroom, or any other number of things. That ambiguity, which totally existed in the original text messaging systems, feeds into the teenage anxiety. Did I say the wrong thing and make them upset? Are they ignoring me, or are they just busy with their own lives? I wish they'd just respond. And the counterpoint to that is Alex's tendency to, anxiously chat way too fast when awkward conversations come up. Everyone does this in one-on-one chat conversations, even verbally, but it's something that was really, really common back then, attempting to push past hard conversations or bury the embarrassing thing you said by just saying a ton of things all at once. And the game manages to simulate that by presenting you with lots of options rapidly, one after the other, with no pause to let the other character speak or wait for their response. It engineers this anxious chat pattern really well, and I love when the other characters react to it. Secret Little Haven is really interested in capturing the intensity and bigness of the emotions of a teenager, the fact that online communities in 1999 were both more intimate and more fragile, and the ability of the internet to help you discover people, media, and ideas you would never have heard of otherwise. And while I've pussyfooted around this idea the whole video, that is the core of the game. The Pretty Guardians Love Force forums aren't just Alex's haven because it's where she's safe to be herself, it's her haven because it allows her to become herself. It's not just a game about being young, or a game about the internet in 1999, but a game about being a young trans girl discovering that fact through the internet in 1999. And up until this point, I've avoided any real specific spoilers, but I feel like to conclude we really need to take a look at Alex's specific journey and not just the tech she used to get here. So, spoilers for the end from this point onward? The arc of the game sort of compresses a whole adolescence's worth of self-discovery into just a few short days, leading Alex to go from an unthinking rejection of masculine hobbies and friends and towards a super girly anime, then to recognize that she may want to be a girl when presented with certain ideas and imagery, followed by a discovery that transgender people are a thing and that gender is mutable, to advocating for other friends to recognize this fact, and finally ending in a confrontation with her father, who stands in as something of a metaphor for a lifetime of masculine expectations that she longs to be freed from. Alex's attempts to deal with her dad all happen on a separate screen, isolated from the rest of the game's chats. And here too we find the game using its technology to frame its ideas, but it's handled a little differently. First, it's obviously a more traditional computer interface. Gray and boring, the hard lines and utilitarian nature evoking a certain masculinity Alex feels constrained to conform to, and the desaturated colors evoking a joyless depression compared to the pinks and yellows of her normal desktop. The game also uses a glitchy bug to render her father's messages beyond the boundaries of the screen. As a figure in Alex's life, his words and authority transcend the borders and boundaries of the computer world, literally and figuratively. And the game also uses its instant messenger to lie to the player. Dialogue choices you make are changed once John responds to make you look like you're being insolent or rude. This is subtle, but it's also sort of a great shorthand for Alex's self-doubt. It highlights how her dad is turning everything she says around on her, and it implies a degree of gaslighting on his part. These, I guess you could call them boss battles, are surprisingly effective drama as a result of all these tools. All of this leads to a final confrontation where Alex is ready to face her dad directly about his behavior, having gained both self-confidence and self-knowledge through the support of her online friends. It's a statement about how life being lived online does in fact have meaning, as it empowers Alex to make changes to better her own situation, though I don't know if it fully works. The intent is clear, but it's also the one time the game really throws the idea of how these chat applications really work out the window in favor of something a bit more abstract. When Alex's father talks down to her or speaks about his plans for her, a text response from one of your friends pops up and defends you. The metaphor is clear. You're drawing on the lessons and esteem given to you by your friends who respect you to finally have the ability to have this difficult conversation with your father, but it's a little too surreal given how extraordinarily grounded the game was up until this point, both from a narrative perspective and a how this tech works perspective. That said, it is also very in keeping with the anime schoolgirl spirit that drives most of Alex's fandom obsession, so I can't say it's wholly out of place either. The game ends not with Alex having come out to her father, or having begun transitioning, or even figured out what, if any, transition she'd like. Instead, the game ends with Alex taking that first step of reclaiming a degree of autonomy and respect from her father, an insistence that he listen to her instead of simply bark orders, to gain the ability to set her own path rather than the path that had been laid out for her. It's not the end of her journey, but the beginning. The future is now open to her, and where it will take her remains vague but optimistic. The game's final hour or so settles on a mantra of, "You'll figure it out," a message of reassurance passed between women all going through their own struggles. Alex needs to be told that by others to begin developing her sense of self-confidence. Eventually she starts telling it to her friends after confronting her dad, and ultimately at the end of the game feels that she believes it enough to tell it to herself. Secret Little Haven feels more than a little autobiographical, but in these final moments it also feels like an assurance sent back in time to a teenage self. It's a journey through vague, confusing adolescent feelings that has led our protagonist to one undeniable truth. And its views on the internet culture that was may be romantic and wistful, but it finds hope in the idea that we can stare into the screen and find not just a community or some new ideas, but ourselves.